nice. Everything is green, flowers everywhere. Spring migration is winding down, right, Andy? But there are still late migrants going through. Esther's husband, my dad, died in January 2004. Funeral plans were frustrating because there were many Montana relatives unable to come on short notice. So our 92-year-old Aunt Virginia suggested postponing things and having a memorial service in May when the azaleas are in bloom. Azaleas are a big deal if you live in Montana. Mom enjoyed the service immensely and the reunion with friends and relatives so much that she informed Eric, myself, and Dave Lovelace in no uncertain terms that she wanted the same thing for herself. So here we are. The most obvious and troubling difference from 11 years ago is the small size of this group. So many of the close friends and relatives that I remember right out here 11 years ago when I did this are either no longer with us or simply unable to come. But Mom wanted this to be a celebration of her life, a reunion, and a joyous occasion. With so much of the next generation here today, all are the next generation, that really shouldn't be a problem. Like Dave said, I hope everybody can join us downstairs afterwards for conversation and hors d'oeuvres. I may be a bit biased, but I believe my mother, Esther, was a fascinating lady. She truly lived the American dream. She worked hard to rise above an austere background, which has also already been described as having something to do with the very old world, shall we say, old-time Polish Catholic Church. She was raised in a mostly Polish working-class neighborhood in Buffalo, New York. English was a second language for her parents, and in fact for Esther herself. Eric somehow managed to find my mother's father's, my grandfather's, 1917 World War I draft card. He listed his occupation as a self-employed electrician with 3 dependents, mother, father, and sister. He also listed his disability as hunchback, which is what they called untreated kyphoscoliosis in my opinion, much less gentle era. Her father had little schooling, but for a while actually had a good job with the Pierce Arrow Automobile Company. He worked with the design and production of the electrical system. Pierce Arrow was a victim of the Depression, and when he lost that job, he started a home-based custom cabinetry business that my mother recalled very well. The one thing that Esther, my mother, often said or quoted about her father was that he told her over and over again, even though he himself was uneducated, that she should, by all means, pursue an education, saying that education was the one thing that they can't take away from me. Coming from my grandfather, the word they probably conveyed a lot of meaning. My mother attended a very strict Polish-speaking parochial school in Buffalo through the 8th grade. She recalls not learning English well until high school because it was Polish-speaking. Attending East Buffalo High School, she did very well. But she did, at that point, develop some doubts about authority, which lasted maybe the rest of her life. Mingling with Protestants for the first time in high school, she discovered that some of them seemed like good people. This made no sense at the time, as she had been taught from an early age that they were all destined to go to hell. So Mom was a very good student, growing up in the shadow of this conservative Polish church. One of her prouder stories was telling how she had been thrown out of the church 3 times. The first time was in 8th grade when she was selected to participate in the all-city marching band. The church ordered her not to participate because there were Protestants in this band. Her parents, uneducated, unconnected, no media back then, stepped up at this time, supported her, and had her participate. Fortunately, the church eventually forgave her for this transgression. Her second conflict came at the end of high school. She was accepted from high school into the University of Buffalo chemistry program, which at that time was a pretty big deal. Chemistry was the Microsoft, Intel, and Cisco systems of that era. The church forbid her from accepting. They said that that was no place for a girl, a good girl, not only because of the Protestants at the university, but because they taught evolution. Once again, her parents stepped up, supported her, and insisted that she go to the University of Buffalo. The church eventually forgave this transgression as well, but until her third run with the church. Having heard these stories many times, I really can't help but to feel proud of my grandparents, her parents at the time, for what they were capable of doing with no media, no education, very little that you learned about the outside world. So she went to the University of Buffalo, got a BS in chemistry, and in 1946, she and a young lady from Carnegie Mellon were hired by DuPont Research as their first two female chemists. The other girl, Stephanie Wallach, became a lifelong friend and about the same age as my mother, and also passed away last year at the age of 90. Stephanie never married, but as some of you might know, had an unusually colorful career as a research chemist with DuPont. My mother chose a different path. She wanted a family, so she promptly married her boss, retired from DuPont, and started raising her 4 kids. Oh yeah, her third run-in with the church was for marrying a Protestant. Unfortunately, she would never forgive for that. So she became a professional mother. She and Dad built the Walnut Ridge home in 1956. I've often wondered what that new house must have looked like to that Polish girl that grew up in that Depression-era world of downtown Buffalo. So they raised their 4 kids, all of whom did well, of course, but maybe not quite as well as your grandchildren, most of whom are here today. She took immense pride in her grandchildren, probably more than her own kids, even though they were all raised very far from Delaware. 7 of them are here today. Emily, you're going to hear from in a minute because my mother requested that Emily tell a little bit about one of her birding trips. Then we have Ellen from Montana, Logan from Virginia, Allison from Chicago, Suzanne from Maine, Stephen from Chicago, Bradley from Indiana. Logan Swagger is here today. Logan, as you may know, graduated from the Naval Academy and is currently a naval officer with the United States Navy. He would occasionally show up in his full naval uniform and escort her to church. When he did so, she was so proud of that uniform that she would literally float down the aisle. Another big thing in my mother's life, as you've already heard, was birding. She told me that she first got hooked on birding in the 1940s when my dad took her out and showed her a rose-breasted grosbeak through his modern, at the time, binoculars. If any of you don't know what a rose-breasted grosbeak is, it's one of the 3 birds on the cover of Peterson's bird guide. It's the one with the black head and the rose-colored triangle on the breast. Beautiful bird. Anyhow, while the kids were growing up, believe it or not, my mother was quite busy taking care of the house and the kids and really didn't do a whole lot of birding. She did some. After the kids grew up, Stan and Esther became very involved with the Delmarva Ornithologic Society and had lots of close birding friends. A few of which are here today, most of which, of course, are in their same age group. They became very skilled at field identification. They did lots of local birding, counts, etc., and they went on trips all over the country. They and their friends, their group of friends, actively mentored a group of younger birders, including yours truly. I didn't take up birding until I was in residency, my late 20s when I was living in New York. So I would learn birding when I would come down here and visit. picked it up because my mother sent me a letter talking about all these birds she had seen on her Christmas bird count. So, Albany in the winter doesn't have many birds. So I sent a letter back saying, well, I went on a bird walk this morning, and here's my bird list. 1 starling, 2 chickadee, 3 crow. She promptly wrote me right back and told me that if I had any brains at all, I would have seen a lot more birds than that. That was where my birding started. So anyhow, I learned a lot of birding when I would come down and visit. They would drive me all over Delaware and South Jersey. And besides learning the birds, I was always impressed at how they seemed to know where every single bird was in Delaware and South Jersey. Another young protege of theirs, who was about my age, was my lifelong friend Andy Edney, who fortunately is here today. He was a little smarter than me and had the good sense to start in high school. Andy is a part-time nurse practitioner and a full-time ornithologist. Right, Andy? Another protege was an even younger man named Jeff Gordon, who is now the president of the American Birding Association. Last year, he performed as the president the astounding feat of moving the American Birding Association national headquarters from where it had always been in Colorado to Delaware City, which is where it is right now. Well, they had a lot of good years, my parents did. My mother's latter years were challenging, to say the least, as many of you, I think, know. The last few years of Stanley's life were very physically exhausting for her. He passed away in 2004. After that, my mother approached living alone with courage and optimism. Living alone, I have to emphasize, because we were all far away. Eric being the closest at 3.5 hours, and he literally tried to be up here as much as he possibly could. But fate being what it is, a month after my dad's service, right here, she fell and broke a hip in our driveway. Her convalescence was complicated by near fatal Clostridium colitis, and she was very lucky simply to survive that. About the time she was finally starting to regain her mobility, she was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, which, in a very unusual fashion, progressed rapidly on her. She stayed at Walnut Ridge as long as she could, in fact longer actually, and spent the last 2 years in a nursing home completely immobilized from her Parkinson's disease. These years, Dave knows these years very well. Living alone in that house at Walnut Ridge, she would make frequent phone calls to me, to Eric, to Dave, at all hours of the day. The Hocassin Fire Department got to know her very well. Those were very trying times. But I remember my mother as a stay-at-home mom, 100% devoted to her family. She was an impeccable housekeeper. The house was always spotless. She loved to cook, and when we were kids, we and all the friends nicknamed her the best cook in Delaware. She also loved Christmas. Christmas was a big deal. Piles of wrapped gifts would begin growing shortly after Thanksgiving. The house was always decorated to the hilt. Sometimes her austere past would show through, and we would see a doom and gloom side of her, which was not unexpected. Every minor illness or lump and bump was potentially fatal and could cause a panic attack in my mother. On the other hand, she would let us roam the neighborhood and countryside unsupervised at a very early age, and we had a very big woods. Mom, you truly did good. You created a great family, many of whom came a long ways to celebrate your life today. We thank you from the bottom of our hearts for everything you did in creating us. We love you and we'll miss you forever.